this is, yes, indeed, the first of our new series. And the idea really behind it is not simply to invite the author of a book to come and stand and give a précis, but to open up the whole thing to a much more conversational approach, so that we can consider not only what's in the book, but reactions to the book, the intentions of the author behind the book, and really consider how the book in the round, as it were. So if we can have the next slide, we can see who our author is and what our text is. So as Nick has mentioned, Cartography, the Ideal and its History. Matthew has waved that around. We'll show you the front cover in a moment. And just to introduce ourselves as well, Matthew, you can see his very distinguished pedigree there, and you can also see the blog which Nick was talking about is the bottom line on the right-hand side there. For those of you who don't know, I'm Liz Bagent. I'm here at the University of Oxford, and with Nick Millea, whom you've already met, I co-convene the Oxford Seminars in Cartography, TOSCA, which is where we are this evening. Now, of course, that title, TOSCA, the Oxford Seminars in Cartography, could turn out to be ill-chosen, because Matthew is going to say some rather challenging things about the whole nature of cartography. So it may, of course, have a ramifications close to home. Nick and I may need to change our title. Could we move on, please? So one of the reasons that we thought it would be very good to invite Matthew to open this series is because he's consistently taken in his scholarly career an approach that's grounded very distinctly in clear and very, very high quality empirical work. Archival work has been unstinting, and his reading in the secondary literature has been unstinting, but he's also always wanted to take a theoretical approach to examine the methodological underpinnings of what he does himself and of what his peers in the history of cartography world do. And that really was seen from the start. And we have here an image of his mapping an empire, the geographical construction of British India. And I think that in a way set the scene for his later work by taking a project, as it were, the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, but not simply looking at the workings of that survey, but really looking to see what it said about the construction of a political entity, a cultural entity, and how that worked at a much more theoretical level as well. And since that publication, Matthew's gone on to publish a very large number of things and to be an instigator in a number of things, including, as you'll see on our next slide, the History of Cartography project. So you can see here all the covers, which Matthew's kindly put together this composite slide for us. I'm happy to say that if you're not familiar with that grand work, you can get free access to these asterisked volumes there, which you can see on the slide. And I do warmly encourage you to look at licensed copies if you can get hold of them for volume 4, which is the one with which Matthew has been particularly involved. So these volumes really again set the scene for what we're going to be talking about this evening, because they have not only codified research in the history of cartography, they have expanded enormously our appreciation of the map, of the process of mapping, of the personalities and the better and unknown of the people involved in mapping. So they've really hugely served not only to put the discipline of the history of cartography on the scholarly scene, on the scholarly map, we could say, but they've also really broadened out our theoretical understanding of things, as well as our empirical knowledge of them. And on to the next, please. Because here is what we're going to be discussing this evening. This is the book that we'll be thinking about. And Matthew kindly points out where we can buy it. That's the link if you'd care to do that. And I'm sure that that will be of interest to many. So again, maybe move on just to the next. Before we get on to a serious discussion, I personally, I found the cover of your book extremely intriguing, Matthew. I came across the person, James Wilde the Younger, who was the man behind this great globe when I was working on the Dictionary of National Biography, and I wrote his article and that of his father and son. And he was an important map maker and seller. And you can see he inherited the Faden business, and then it passed through 3 generations of the family to the Wastrel 3rd generation, who then passed it on. And this was a rather wonderful great globe, or monster globe, some people even called it, which was erected for a decade in Leicester Square. And you can see some rather wonderful top-hatted individuals and long-skirted individuals inside the great globe, getting a very immediate geographical experience there, an experience of mapping, of cartography at first hand. So can I ask you why you chose that, Matthew, of all the images that you might have chosen? Why was that one that you particularly wanted to associate with the book?
Well, the decision for that to be on the front cover was actually made by the press. Presses always want fun images that will be grabbing and attractive, and that they don't have to pay special permission fees to have on the front cover of a book. So they actually asked me, what do they want? And I gave a couple of suggestions. This was one of them. And this is one they went with. I really wanted another one, which I'll show later. But I just like it. I mean, it's just such a phenomenal project that is really not well known to people today. The whole idea of building a gigantic globe that you actually go into, and then to be able to see the world in a way that mimics how we think maps should be made. So as we'll get into, there's a thing we'll come back to, the observational preconception, by which we preconceive the nature of the way in which maps get made. And in the early modern period, there's lots of people talking about geographical maps as if they were views from above. But after 1800, we get this idea shifts and becomes the expectation that this is not only the view that maps give you, but it's actually how they were made. And so this image really encapsulates that preconception at the same time as being very dramatic and eye-grabbing, and therefore perfect to put on the cover of a book.
Excellent, thank you. I think it also shows something else which I quite like to come back to at the end, which is the accessibility of the map to a wide audience, the wide appeal of that. So it'd be good if we could come to that at the end. So let's move on to the next slide and tackle the book itself. And really, I wanted to ask you why you wrote the book, why you wrote it at this point, not only in your career, but in the whole historiography of the history of cartography, and whom you had in mind as you were writing. So why you wrote it now, and whom you wrote it for.
Well, basically, I've been increasingly frustrated by the state of the field as a whole. You know, as you mentioned, there's a period of change in the 1980s primarily, where people started to rethink the natures of maps. We dramatically expanded the subject matter of map studies. But after about 1995, after about 15 years of active debate, that pretty much dried up. We sort of got comfortable with what I call a sociocultural approach, or a Harleyan approach, Harley-esque approach maybe. It all seemed to be very easy, and we got down to studying maps and interpreting them and so on, both as cultural documents and as social instruments. But it always seemed to be lacking in a degree of thought. You know, Harley, for example, is always touted as being a sort of postmodern, post-structural figure, but I don't know if he ever really was truly postmodern, post-deconstructionist, post-structuralist, whatever. He always wanted to have multiple levels of meaning in the map, which of course Foucault, Derrida, and all the rest would say, no, 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 no. No, there's the image, there's the text. There's nothing beneath the text. There's no, everything is there. And nobody really has taken those sort of Harley's ideas and actually sort of pushed them forward and taken them forward. So I got really, really dissatisfied in various ways. In particular, the idea that there is such a thing as cartography and so on, which we'll come to. So I set out to write a statement, and it was really, I began writing it for myself as a way to say, the way to work through a whole bunch of ideas, and if it got published, great. And like all my projects, it sort of grew and grew and grew and grew until it became completely unwieldy and untenable. And a good friend, Max Edelson, who read a draft, said, yeah, you got 1.5 books here. Let's separate them out. And so I took the one book, and that became Cartography. The next book is actually what I'm working on right now, which is the history of map studies, history of map history, history of to some degree of academic cartography. And then the third book, which comes from these, the rest of the big project, will be called Mapping as Process. So in a way, we've got a 3-part sequence. This is the problem, how the problem has not gone away, how should we study maps to avoid the problem, in effect. And my writing, I've tried to write it for, first of all, for myself, but as I thought about, okay, this is going to be a book, I've tried to write it as a general approach for anybody who wants to study maps and mapping from a cultural, social point of view. This is not a popular book, but it's not, and while it's dense, it's not necessarily heavily theoretical. So I'm trying for a broad academic audience. Hopefully people will like it from a popular point of view, but it's really an academic book.
Thank you. So that's useful. And I think you've already let us into the secret that this is what Victorian publishers, Victorian novelists would have called a triple decker. So this is, yeah. So this is the first deck that we can expect.
It just might extend to be a 4-decker. We'll see how it goes.
So with that said, let's move on to the next slide and the rather provocative quotation there. So what we thought, given that it's a fairly dense book, we thought that we would go through section by section and invite Matthew to summarize and explain what he intended with this, with each of the sections, and then we'd have a brief chat about it. Matthew, over to you.
Sure. So the key point, when I mentioned just now that I got increasingly frustrated, and I'm still very frustrated by the level and the nature of conceptual debate in map studies, map history, academic cartography generally. In large part because every time you start talking about the nature of this subject, we immediately get hung up on what is a map. You can start talking about cartography and immediately everybody says, oh, well, to define cartography is map making. So to define cartography, we need to define what a map is. And you end up with all sorts of discussions about what is a map. And what nobody has ever thought about is really, is it meaningful to ask that question? Because it presupposes a single category of things that we can say, this is a map and that's not a map. And the way that people have defined maps has been either through various kinds of functional definitions, maps are things that help you get from A to B, or formal definitions, maps are a picture of the world, whatever it may be. None of the definitions of map that's been promulgated for the last 200 years are actually universal. They don't cover all the different things that we now accept as being maps. So why? And what I realized when I started writing this whole series, as you said, it began as a prompt from a book by Jeremy Smith, a linguistic historian of the English language at Glasgow. He wrote a book called An Historical Understanding of the English Language. And I thought, this is what we need. We need a book on an historical understanding of cartography. And as I started writing, this is what I really tried to write. And as I got into it, I realized that cartography is the problem, that it doesn't really exist. And so, but there's this whole body of concepts, of what I'm calling preconceptions, that interact with each other, sometimes contradictory. That's where the humor comes in. Like Lewis Carroll ideas of map at 1-to-1. There's rooted in contrasts and contradictions between preconceptions. That there's this body of presumptions that what maps are, what map making is, that have shaped and guided how we write about maps, how we think about maps, how we study maps, that are completely unexamined. And one of those preconceptions that comes out of this is the idea that there is such a thing as the map, that there is this unambiguous, coherent category of phenomena. And so that's the epigraph for chapter 1. There is no such thing as cartography, and this is a book about it. Shamelessly ripping off Stephen Shapin's book, a comment about the scientific revolution. He had a book called The Scientific Revolution, in which he began, there's no such thing as a scientific revolution. And this is a book about it. So the whole idea then is to talk about, of this book, is to talk about this ideal and to explore it and to try to expose it in a way that has never been done before. And so rather than asking what is a map, what I'm posing is, what is cartography? How is this belief system structured, its idealization structured, and how is that idealization, how is it evolved historically, developed historically?
And by hitting on this very polemical epigram there, is there a sense that historians of cartography have got a bit cozy, a bit sort of satisfied with what they do, and sort of failed to examine their preconceptions? Is that your...
Well, absolutely. And it's not just historians of mapping, it's everybody who is engaged academically with maps. I mean, if you go on to the next slide, please, Steph. You know, one of the things I do in the second chapter is there's actually two parts to the chapter. The first part is an exploration of how people have studied the idea of the map and how it's progressively grown, and how some people have sort of played with the idea of cartography and the ideal. So the Mark Twain map of Paris, wonderfully absurdist product. That's what I really wanted to have on the cover of the book, but it's just too different. It's not recognizable in the way that the wild Great Globe is. So it doesn't really quite have that marketing push. So there've been a variety of people, Twain, Lewis Carroll, we all know the Borges quote about making the map a 1-to-1 that's fallen apart into ruins. These are all attempts to sort of play with the internal contradictions within the larger ideal of cartography without actually critiquing the entirety. And so what I find is that even the most sophisticated scholars who have developed a very complex, rigid, well, not rigid, but internally rigorous, I should say, theoretical structure for understanding maps and mapping. Even they engage with what I've come to think of as the intellectual game of whack-a-mole. You whap one idea, one misconception on its head, and another one pops right back up. It's really hard to get through this. So I cite some examples. Somebody says, no, a map is not a picture. Great. They're challenging the preconception of pictorialness. And then immediately they say, what it is, it's a proposition about location, which is the ontological preconception writ large. It's really frustrating. And you see it among established scholars, you see it amongst incomers to the field who might have really great command of literary scholarship, art historical scholarship, but they come to the map and they throw it all in the air and go, oh, a map. It's about place, it's about pictures, it's about the world. So what I'm trying to do in 2 then is to show this is how people have tried to come to the ideal of cartography, but keep missing it. And then the second part, which is then to say, well, okay, so how can we start to study cartography? Or should I say, how should we study the things that are called maps without relying on the idea of cartography as this idealization? And that's where I present, basically this in half a chapter will be the 3rd book, Mapping as Process. This is just a very succinct statement. This is how you can start to understand mapping, networks of mapping, of producing, circulating, and consuming maps. And it boils down to a fundamental point. We have a material divide, material preconception. That splits the epochs of map making. There's the era before the map is made that produces this material thing. And then we've got the subsequent epoch where this thing is then used. And so it doesn't matter whether you're brilliant geographer like Julian Rose or Dennis Cosgrove and a whole bunch of other people. They start the way in which conceptualizations of the nature of maps and mapping have been written has been around where there's all the issues around the making of the thing and all the issues around the using of the thing. And they come together in this little moment of the map as this physical material object. And graphically, it's like 2 circles with a bar in between, like a pair of handcuffs, image in volume 3. What we're really doing is we need to get rid of this idea of 2 loops connected by this material thing in which information is flowing around. And we need to think about materiality and the strategies of performativity in many cases, by which we have a single circuit within particular networks of knowledge in which the things that constitute maps physically or immaterially, they circulate in a single loop between producers and consumers. We have this idea there's map making, there's map using, we've always split the 2 apart. But going back to Jeremy Smith and his historical understanding of the English language, he just had a throwaway comment, which just made me didn't make me fall off the chair. I was sitting on a London train at the time when I was reading it. That would have been a bit too obvious. But it suddenly made me jerk and really start thinking. He said, the users of a system all participate in the system, the speaker of a language, the listener, the writer, the reader. Everybody is partaking of this system of knowledge, of representational structures. And that's what geography, that's what mapping is. There's no hard and fast distinction between production and consumption. What joins them is circulation. And so by thinking in these terms, we can start to realize that there's not one kind of map making. There are many gazillions of very precise spatial discourses within which information about space maps is communicated and circulated and in various strategies, and that those strategies are different for different functions and different networks. At a big picture, we can define broad modes of mapping, geographical mapping, property mapping, place mapping, and so on, around which we've been structuring the last volumes of the history of cartography as well. All of which is to say that there is no such thing as cartography. Cartography is this sort of nice, comfy blanket that overlays all the variations and the variability in different ways of mapping, and hides all the obscurity in this seeming blanket of uniformity. And it's completely not there. We need to strip it off the bed, you know. What we need to be studying is the mapping processes, not this, and not allow ourselves to get caught in this trap of thinking about cartography as a singular, universal endeavor.
Does that?
That's a bit of a rant, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We're slightly getting out of our sequence here, but can I just interrupt perhaps that to say, we have always in the past kind of united in thinking it is the material object that deserves our attention, and we're interested in the processes in as much as they give rise to the material object and in as much as they illuminate what the material object does. So are you challenged, and that has proved an illuminating approach in as much as it's enabled us to link up, for example, with idea of sort of materiality in general, but also ideas of from the history of the book and performativity and so on. So it seems there a danger in your approach that we'll lose our focus on the map, that we'll get caught up in the process and we'll lose that focus on the map. Well,
no, I mean, there's a very fundamental point here, and this is one of the areas where the book gets misread a bit. That's why it needs a whole damn book at the end to talk about mapping as process. The process is not what we do with maps. The process is mapping. So when you look at indigenous mapping in particular, there is a huge amount of evidence now that talks about the act of mapping, the communication of spatial complexity as a oral, gestural, performative process, whether it's between indigenous groups, whether it's between indigenous groups and Westerners, Western interlopers, the strategies by which we communicate spatial information are ongoing processes. I mean, in a way, I mean, just reveal my background. This is like when Adam Pratt starts talking about, back in the day, about the idea of place. Place doesn't just exist. It's not something that gets constructed and ossifies. Place isn't being, place is becoming. Place is always the idea of the concept of a given location, what it means to the inhabitants, what it means to outsiders, is constantly changing. It's constantly under revision, constantly being challenged and negotiated. And so the process of mapping is not just the production and so on, but it's also the reading of the maps to create new information, new understandings. So it's the ways in which we play with maps, but also the fact that the mapping itself entails multiple forms of representation, multiple strategies of representation that are not separate. So even in the West, we still negotiate personal spaces using strategies that are very, very similar, not the same, but sort of structurally similar to those of indigenous peoples elsewhere. It's just that we have created this huge body of things we call maps as graphic things that we want, in the West, we want to privilege as being, this is how you do space. whereas even we do space in multiple ways. And we forget that. Geographers haven't, but map people have. So it's not enough just to look at a map. It's also wondering about, well, how is this being circulated? How is it being used in all sorts of different circumstances by which new information, new readings are created? So it's a much more fundamental point than just talking about networks. It's the as a unity of process, is an underlying structure that manifests itself. I come to think of maps as epiphenomena of the processes. The maps are just the things that are created that we can see of this underlying structure, but the structure isn't fixed. The structures are variable and they get reformed. So there's thousands of these things. Again, I'm ranting.
That's fine. Let's unpick those things by moving on to chapter 3.
Yes.
So yeah, do you want to summarize that for us, probably relatively briefly, so that we don't get too far into question time?
Yeah. So basically, as I thought about how people have studied maps and how we talk about maps and the assumptions we make about what maps are, they boil down into a number of these preconceptions. So I already talked about the observational preconception, that maps are based, that necessarily maps are based on observation, preferably observation from above. And you can see that kind of idea forming with balloon flights, with the wild globe, and then Kay Shperker's sort of Cosmos in 4D jumps, which is going to get popularized in Powers of 10 by the Morrisons and other people. And you can sort of, if you zoom in close enough, at the top left corner, you have atoms. As you pull out and get into the color portion, then you've got the blood and veins and hands and the stuff that we can see by eye, all the way out to the earth. And then as you keep pulling out and get back into monochrome, because you can't actually see it, you start getting all the views from space. And the whole concept being that all representation is a matter of perspective, a matter of observation. Whether you are at the atomic level, whether you're talking about multiple galaxies, galactic clusters, there is this fundamental point that representation equals observation, equals measurement, equals some kind of mimesis or metricality of some sort. And there are others. The ontological preconception, for example, is the idea that maps are basically storage items for data. There's an essence of data, that the map and the spatial archive are somehow related. Individuality, that there's a preconception that maps are made by people, by individuals, and are read by individuals, that map making, map reading are utterly individualistic, and therefore we can assess the cognitive capacity of makers and users of maps by how they use and make maps, which underpins racist and misogynistic ideas about Western versus non-Western, male versus female mapping activities, mapping abilities. And I can go on and on and on. So chapter 3 runs through these preconceptions. Basically, it's the greatest hits of where map studies go wrong. And I start off with a nice long list. So you don't have to read the chapter, just read the first 2 pages of the chapter, which goes through all the different ways. And you can see these concepts popping up here and there in all kinds of work, even the most sophisticated, all the way through to what I think in theoretically crude approaches. Each of these preconceptions are rooted in a history. So we go to the next slide, please, Steph. The proof that cartography is not a universal thing is that there is actually a history to the idea of cartography. And so chapter 4 goes through a whole series of factors from early 19th century into the 20th century, by which the ideal of cartography has developed, not as a simple logical thing, but rather as a whole series of developments that have furthered or reinforced various of these preconceptions. So the London Colosseum of 1829, I just love this image, was this grand precursor to the wild globe, in which people, it's a very picturesque construct, but people would go up the central tower and then they could look out at this huge panorama of London. They could imagine that they were themselves somehow above London, above St. Paul's Cathedral, looking down at the city. You know, no smoke from all the coal fires and the wood fires, no clouds, just this perfect unobstructed vision, which is echoed in balloon flights and so on. So you can start looking at the history of panoramas and balloon flights, and then ultimately into plane flights, about the idea of the view from above, the unobstructed view from above. Or you can look at the coinage of the word cartography in the 1820s, and the rise of mapping professions, and at the end of the 19th century, the rise of personal mobility, bicycles and automobiles in particular, that lead to mass consumption of a different kind of maps that have previously been restricted in use to mostly military. So there's all sorts of different factors involved, each one of which should deserve its own chapter, its own book, each of which reinforces certain preconceptions, maybe not all. And so through the 19th century, we have the ideal emerging. In the 20th century, I talk about the ideal as having the ideal triumphant. And then in the 21st century, we're now getting into the ideal degenerate. We're finally trying to question the ideal in various ways.
Could you,
and each of the...
Before you go on, could you just tell us a little bit about the emergence of the word cartography? I see that that's a question that's been asked, and it may be a good point just to pause a bit to hear your thoughts on that.
So the word cartography is actually coined in 1808. Well, there's a 1789 or so coinage which doesn't get picked up in Paris by a guy called Tessier. Then in 1808, Konrad Malte-Brun, who is a Danish political refugee in Paris, who is well known as an historian of geography, historian of discovery, he coins the word chartography, CH, to refer to a new kind of product in which, in this particular instance, Germany is going to be mapped at a very high, at a contemporarily high degree of resolution, not so high by modern standards, but the entire country in a regular series of sheets. And this is going to be useful to everybody, not just to the military, but to the civil authorities, to the traveler, to the merchant, to the teacher. Everybody is going to be able to use it. It's the general purpose map. It's the birth of the general purpose map of modern academic practice. And he calls this kind of product a work of cartography. The word doesn't go anywhere in 1808. It does get picked up, though, in the 1820s, which is when the French have been talking about remapping of France in the post-Napoleonic period. The military in particular were never happy with the Cassini map of France, the Carte de France. They wanted a new survey. And there's this huge debate after 1815, after the restoration of the Bourbon government, of how to go about mapping all of France. And they really want to map everything from one basic survey that's going to cover cadastral information at very high resolution, all the way to general mapping at the end. And they want to do one single survey that's going to spawn a perfect archive that can be mapped in all sorts of different ways. They realize they can't afford this, so it doesn't actually happen. But the debates in the early 1820s are very much about, well, we could do it if only we had enough people and enough education and enough money to fund it all. There's a sense by the 1820s that all mapping, from a property plan to a regional map, even to a world map, is somehow properly grounded in direct surveys, observation, measurement. And so it's in the 1820s that Conrad Mountbrun starts to use the word cartographie in Paris again, and it gets picked up among other members of the French Geographical Society. And so by the 1830s, it starts to be used more consistently. You can find it being used in Germany by the end of the 1830s, and so on. So it's a word that is then that's created to cover the endeavor, this idea of a singular endeavor, as it stood, as it appeared based on contemporary mapping technology. But of course, it's a neologism, it's a new creation. So everybody else who then comes across it thinks, huh, what is cartography? I don't recognize that word, but well, I know cart and I know graphy. And so there's this whole proliferation of different meanings that then get given to the word because people don't know what it means. And so they read it strictly as a description of maps, or the writing about maps, or the writing of maps. And you end up with this very long, confusing usage that only just helps the ideal of cartography, because it seems that everything is encompassed about mapping. Everything is encompassed within this term.
Thank you. I'd love to ask lots of questions, but we must press on, otherwise there won't be time for questions from the floor. So maybe have the next slide, please.
So, right. So I said that each one of these factors that have contributed to the formation of the ideal is very much really deserves its own chapter length or book length treatment. So one of them is the development of the history of cartography, which is the next book, in effect. Another one is this concept of map scale. I tell you, you could, for decades, you could ask map scholars, historians not, who created the idea of a mathematical ratio of saying that a map is a scale of 1 to 63,360 or 1 to 10,000 or whatever it may be? And nobody would know. It's such a fundamental part of the ideal of cartography. So chapter 5 is about the formation of the idea of map scale as a universal attribute of all maps, such that if you can't define a mathematical numerical ratio for a map, then it's not a map. And so you end up with, the famous London map underground of London Underground. Well, it's not really a map, it's a diagram. That key word keeps coming back, diagram, because it doesn't have a scale. And so what I argue in 5 is basically go through the different geometries by which, in the early modern period, there's a proportionality is constructed between a map and the world. I'm not saying that maps weren't made to scale. The phrase to scale actually means you use a ruler, a scaled ruler, to define your units on the map. That goes way back into our oldest scale map is 2000 BCE, the statue of Gudea. I'm not saying that people didn't make maps to scale, rather that the different ways of talking about or representing proportionality, the scale itself, the ladder-like bar, verbal expressions, 1 inch to the mile, direct expressions, writing on the map itself, this is 10 miles. These are all different ways of expressing this proportionality, and they not only denote that proportionality, they also connote various cultural significances. And I've got this map on the screen because what happens with the rise of the modern systematic survey based on triangulation, you have the blending of the two main geometries, the plane and the cosmographical. And this is what then leads early in the 19th century to the creation of the idea of map scale, the idea of a numerical ratio to express the degree of proportionality between the map and the world, which initially begins just as an engineering device for very large scale maps. But by the 20th century is being applied to every kind of map. Even world maps start to get a representative fraction applied to them, which makes no sense because of map projection distortions. And we have this whole classification of large scale and small scale and all the rest. So chapter 5 then is one example of one of these factors in chapter 4 that underpins the preconceptions outlined in chapter 3. There is a structure to this book.
Can I jump in there to say that you've eloquently outlined that's kind of Whiggish progression and in your chapter 4 of this sort of ideal of cartography, the ideal map, and then focused here on this the problem of map scale, or however we want to express that. Historians of cartography like to think that they know that that's not the way we do things. They kind of know that technological scientific accuracy or whatever isn't what makes a good map. They know that the sort of map scale, the arrival of map scale isn't the binary that we once thought it was. So we obviously think we're deceiving ourselves and that we don't really know that. We don't really take that into account in our discourse. Is that the case?
Yeah, so you're expressing a concern that comes out of the sociocultural change of the 1980s. But even now, even in a popular level, there's still plenty of people who will talk about maps as being accurate or not accurate. I mean, just go to the people who want to just take digitized images and rubber sheet them to modern geography to just say, well, how accurate was this map? You know, there's still this impulse based on this broad, culturally wide ideal of cartography. So on the one hand, the ideal is still very much with us in that respect. Secondly, even though a small body of scholars within map history have rejected accuracy as a necessary element of a map analysis, and quite properly so, we still fall back on a popular distinction between large scale, small scale, medium scale, terms which are never defined precisely. There, you cannot find any agreement in the literature about what exactly is large scale, what exactly is small scale. There's some agreement about broad ranges, but no one's ever been able to define it. But at the same time, there's still this sense of, well, we can define maps by their scale. We still routinely use large scale, small scale, and get it wrong frequently because it's a mathematical relationship. We organize our libraries that way. It's of maps and materials. It's still a fundamental concept within map history, but it's one of these concepts that has never been examined. It's just lurking in the background, ready to bite us on the ass whenever we're not looking carefully.
A good point to move on to looking at chapter 6. So this is sort of a summary of your.
So the summary then, and the quote on page 233, that cartography deserves to die, has probably been the most misunderstood comment in the entire book. Cartography itself doesn't deserve to die because cartography itself is a concept. It's nothing that we actually do. What we actually do is geographical mapping or geodetic mapping or topographic mapping, hydrographic mapping, whatever it may be. Lots and lots and lots of different kinds of mapping. Cartography is this idealization that covers everything, that generates all sorts of preconceptions about how we study maps, what maps are, how we should study them. The ideal of cartography deserves to die. All the misconceptions embodied in the ideal of cartography deserve to die. So that should have been a larger statement, more qualified. So basically, in the conclusion, it's we should never use the word cartography unless we're actually talking about the ideal of cartography. It's not the history of cartography, it's mapping history or map history, history of maps, history of mapping. As soon as you start using the word cartography, you start to bring on board all sorts of wrong ideas that are deeply, deeply embedded and have been for 200 years in how our culture understands the map. But in its own right, we don't have the map. We can never talk about the map or a map as being exemplar for all maps. What we need to study are the mapping modes, or more precisely, spatial discourses within which maps are produced, circulated, consumed, not think about cartography. So basically, I just want to explode the whole thing.
Excellent. Which leads me on to the next slide, when we consider another explosive figure. We haven't really articulated quite so much where you see this fitting into Harleyan challenges, just in case we have people with us who aren't familiar with the work of Brian Harley. He was, some people have described him as the sort of one of the founding figures of present day history of cartography, or even if we're allowed to say that anymore. He was had a superb empirical understanding of mapping, but was always interested in a theoretical side of things. So opened up lots of new ways of looking at maps as non-neutral, right, political semiotics, cultural studies, representations, and so on. And Peter Barber sort of describes in the latest edition of Imago Mundi how his ideas had become a new paradigm for many historians. So I think the question for you is, the kind of empirical theoretical balance of your work is very reminiscent of Harley. And I wonder how you see your work as fitting into that Harleyan trajectory. Are you saying that maybe we didn't pay enough attention to what he was saying, or he died tragically young?
No, I was saying
he didn't have time.
What I'm really saying is Brian wrote in the 1980s, which is 30 or more years ago. And the field as a whole hasn't really conceptually progressed since. Now, culturally, there are plenty of people who've made profound arguments that have been very influential in various ways. David Harvey, the geographer, in The Condition of Postmodernity, has this whole concept of space-time compression, which he illustrates using a narrative of map making that is thoroughly indebted to work done a century previously in the 19th century. Frederick Jameson, the literary scholar, again, has the whole concept of defining postmodernity that he grounds in part, a narrative of map history that goes back to the mid-19th century. It's really very common, this is the next book, it's really very common for people, both map historians and academic cartographers over the last couple of decades, 25 years, to say, well, there's this old way of doing things, now there's a new way of doing things. And the new way is partly technological, partly because of the internet and GIS has changed production, contemporary mapping practices quite phenomenally, but also conceptually, based on Harley and the like. But so we have this sort of divide between the old and the new, and we can reform ourselves by thinking, we can delude ourselves by thinking that we are now new. We are doing good stuff. We have reformed the field. when you look at what Brian was arguing in terms of the history of the development of the field, going back to R.A. Skelton before him, there's an argument, and also the Portuguese scholar Mando Coração. There's this idea that the way we do map history in the past is wrong and it needs to be reformed. But in order to do that, they told very selective stories about what is the history of cartography, how it has been studied, that ignored huge swaths of work, including Brian's own work and that of David Woodward, to create a mythic history. And it's a mythic history that A, I want to get away from, which is causing all sorts of trouble in my head, but B, it persists and it continues to undermine how even sophisticated scholars, theoretically, conceptually sophisticated scholars, do their work. And so I've had some pushback from contemporary academic cartographers about the book because they don't like it. It's challenging them to think about their concepts of cartography, which changed given the 1980s change in cartographic studies. You know, the adoption of Jacques Bertin's ideas about simulographics, for example, manifestly changed how academic cartography is taught and practiced. But there's still this absolute commitment on the part of straight academic cartographers to maps as scientific, factual, objective documents. Which some may be, but many are not. And we can't study all mapping as if all maps should be scientific and objective. So Brian, writing 30 or more years ago, I mean, the poor man died in 91, really didn't have a chance to take these ideas and really push them forward. In the 80s, he was chopping and changing and adopting new ideas. So what I'm trying to do then is sort of, look to Brian as an example, but I'm really not using him as an, if anything, I'm using him as somebody to react to, not to say Hardy had this point right. Is more, Hardy was sort of okay there, but wrong in these ways. Why was that? What does that say about the ideas behind how we approach maps and mapping?
Thank you. And you've mentioned pushback against some of your ideas. So let's look at the next slide to see some of the reviewers' comments. Perhaps I'll just leave our audience just to read those themselves.
So the first one is by Jerry Broughton.
I was tactfully not mentioning the authors, Matthew.
Yeah. And if you don't know Jerry's work, he's a literary scholar, very prominent in Britain now through his TV work, who's played with maps and stuff. So I think that was a great review in Times Higher Educational Supplement. So the people who
Matthew, let's just leave people just a moment to have to read that, to read those. So I'm wondering now if people have had a chance just to get that little taste of some of the things that people have said. It seemed to me that in reading other reviews, there was a sense in which people thought, well, I'm sure this is an important book, but I don't quite know what to make of it. I don't quite know what impact it's going to have. I'm not quite sure where we go from here. So I'm wondering, before we open to questions, was there any one particular thing in the reviews that you felt had misunderstood what you wanted to say, or maybe pointed out something that you hope to take up later?
I think most of the reviews that aren't from unreconstituted academic cartographers, the reviews that are positive but, shall we say, querulous, is because they all want me to have written a different book. the book that will be Mapping as Process, the third book of the series, everybody is so used to talking about maps and what have you. They've actually sort of, many of them have missed this fundamental point that cartography is a gigantic weight around our necks that's bending us down, and they want me to leap straight to the front end to the end of this whole process without actually going through this process of trying to destroy this weight. Maybe they're overeager. So and again, I think it's part of the question of the level of conceptual debate within map studies generally, that they want to go to, well, tell me what maps are, rather than thinking about it in itself. On the other hand, I do have to admit, this is a book that changed significantly in the writing. As I said, I began thinking about this as part of a larger work with an historical understanding of cartography. And only in the process of writing this book have I actually come to realize that this concept in which I'm trapped, like everybody else by modern culture, is wrong. But in reworking this book several times, I can't guarantee I eliminated all those points. So I do understand it can be a very confusing book because it got rewritten several times in different ways, and I don't necessarily can't guarantee I got rid of everything that's old.
That sounds to
hopefully
me,
the next two books will be better in that respect.
Well, that sounds to me like a good point for us to close our slide presentation and throw this open to the floor. I don't want to take up all the time for questions. So I think Nick has been curating some of the questions that have come through. So I'm going to put myself on mute after I've just thanked Matthew for a really refreshing conversation and allow Nick to open the floor to others.
And thank you, Liz, for the invite. Yes, this was fun. Questions?
Thank you, Liz.
Nick.
Thank you, Matthew. We've got a fair few questions coming on, but I'm going to start with one which is very straightforward and came in quite early on. How do we know what isn't a map?
Okay, so somewhere in here, I just want to go back to this, page 41. All I'm saying is that mapping in the most generic sense is a representation of spatial complexity, and a map is a text that represents spatial complexity. So if you have a text of some sort, it could be graphic, it could be numerate, it could be verbal, it could be written, it could be spoken, it could be gestural, it could be built into the landscape itself, and probably entails multiple versions of all these different strategies together, then, and it's all about trying to have some people understand spatial complexity as opposed and communicate the understanding to others within a closed network, it's a map. If there's not a sense of spatial complexity, then there's not a map, which is a long way to answer your question. In the past, people have thoroughly objected to the utter openness of such a definition. But I'm stuck. I can't look at maps from an historical cultural perspective without any kind of attempt to draw boundaries around a map breaking down in some way. So for me, what's needed is a thoroughly open understanding of maps, because they're just things created through the mapping process. That's really the understanding of mapping. Mapping is a process that creates certain artifacts, epiphenomena, that we think of as, we
Matthew, I think we've lost you. We lost Matthew. Oh, he's back.
I'm
Go on,
sorry.
you're back.
I'm back.
Thank you.
Yes.
Shall we move on to another question, Matthew? This is an interesting one. How do you guide or help your students or researchers approach a map? What questions do you encourage them to ask of a map to avoid the, shall we say, ideal map trap?
The very first step, and this is almost second nature to me now, is to have students explore the very particular circumstances within which maps are made and used, and how maps circulated within them. So that we can say, for example, that a map of Maine made in, I'm going to say 1790 because I can, is somehow the same kind of thing as a map of the Maine seacoast made in 1790. By constantly asking questions about the conceptions of space embedded in a map, by constantly asking questions about the materiality of maps, or immateriality in some cases, which gets into questions of circulation and therefore who gets to consume these maps. So you can start to say, okay, so if this is a map that conceptualizes space this way and is being read by these people, then you can say, aha, this is one kind of mapping, which is quite different from these other kinds of mapping. And also by refusing to use the word cartography. And as it slips out, which it does.
Thank you, Matthew, because that's quite interesting, because it leads quite neatly into another observation which one of our attenders asked. And he wondered whether we require a new vocabulary, perhaps, for those who make and use maps, or something new for people making maps formally or informally. Can we distinguish between those two groups?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that bugs me to no end when people start talking about early modern or even medieval cartographers, because it just is imposing all this baggage onto the past. I think it's a question of the nature of the precise spatial discourse that people partake in. Sometimes they're just humans doing what humans do. In English, we have a nice distinction between mapping and cartography. Some of my French colleagues don't have a clear distinction. We have map, we have chart, they have carte. Now, in the old days, we have carte géographique or carte marine, but there is no formal distinction under the ideal of cartography. So they're having a hard time coming up with alternative words. In German, Germans have always used multiple terms for cartography. And so Germans seem to be going for mapping, Kartierung, as a term. Go to China, where the idea of cartography doesn't exist. They're having a hard time talking about the history of mapping because they don't have a single word for all the different kinds of maps. And so they're having a hard time terminologically. So broadly speaking, we can talk about, if we're going to limit ourselves to the things that can be called maps, then we can still talk about the consumers of maps and producers of maps, map producers, map consumers. In certain contexts, surveyors still makes a great deal of sense. In other contexts, map maker, which personally I like to have as 2 words. American English, I want to put them together. Map user is always 2 words. Why can't map maker be 2 words? It's because the suffix of maker and stuff. So yeah, there's lots of terminological issues involved here.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. you couldn't get away with a session like this without mentioning Brian Harley. So
Right.
that has generated a couple of questions, which I'll try and merge together. One of our questioners has a feeling that Brian's theories had become the paradigm by 1989, but more recent, by 1920, perhaps younger scholars are amalgamating Brian's ideas with more recent ones and moving on from them.
Mhm.
And just to move on to another observation, doesn't an increased focus on the process of mapping necessarily lead to an increased focus on the motives or the intentions of the map maker? So if so, how does this advance on Harley, or is that book 3?
So in terms of looking at, right. So there's actually 2 questions there. One is, the problem is that Brian wrote a lot, and different communities read different parts of his work. So the general community of critical cartographers really like 1989 article, Deconstructing the Map. And map historians, though, like a 1988 article, Maps, Knowledge, and Power. And very few map historians will cite Deconstructing the Map and vice versa. And they're really quite different articles in some respects. And in fact, Deconstructing the Map is, we did a thing for the 20th anniversary of it. And interestingly, I was the only map historian asked to participate in the little series of essays. And what I found is when I went in a Web of Science, I just looked at 3 articles, the 3 most recently cite articles that come up in the found set of works that cite Deconstructing the Map, and found 1 cited it properly, and 2 actually engaged with the concepts, and 2 quote Harley as advancing a position that Harley manifestly didn't advance in Deconstructing the Map, because that article has become, it's not an icon, it's a totem of, you quote it to say, I am dissatisfied with the state of map studies. And if you look at the citation pattern of most articles, most works, you get a steady peak going up as people cite, and then it becomes old hat and the number of citations drop off. Brian is just still going, Deconstructing the Map, Web of Science is just going up, because it's being cited now for different reasons. And then you get this bigger problem that there are other people who've written about maps in different kinds of theoretical ways. Harley had a small portion. Christian Jacob, Dennis Wood, John Pickles, to name 3 extras, and there's plenty of others who've written in various ways back in the 1980-1990 period. And so when you go to a small conference, what you find is, and especially in interdisciplinary conferences, but also geography, cartography, everybody has read different bits of the literature, and everybody ends up talking at cross purposes, which I find very, very frustrating, which is one of the reasons I wrote this damn book. So, which does lead me to the other question, which is, so where am I moving forward from? Well, in a way, pre-Harley, pre-1980, the emphasis of study was on map production. Post-1980, Harley, Wood, everybody else, the shift has been to study map interpretation, map consumption, or the deployment of maps in social instruments, which is very much where my early work was in. And what I'm asking is not to change that, but to achieve a balance between production and consumption, the technology and the culture, through the consideration of circulation. And so some people have called this a post-representational or a non-representational approach. There's a young Italian scholar, Tania Rossetto, who's done incredible work, Martin Dodge, Chris Perkins, and another one I'm blanking on in the UK and Ireland, have similarly argued this, that if you think about mapping as not as the construction of a material thing, but it's a process of interpretation, reinterpretation by consumers, then you end up in this method, this approach of the factuality of the map is something that's continually being negotiated, if indeed it's supposed to be a factual map. It's continually being negotiated by the users. The users are an active component in, the consumers are an active component in creating map meaning. The map isn't defined by the maker, but the user has this role as well, but the user is functioning within this more complex network of conventions and stuff by which maps are supposed to be made for this purpose or that purpose. So by looking at maps, by looking at the circulation of maps, we can get more nuanced. We can stop writing blanket statements that Brian in particular was great at, that apply, yeah, in principle, but they break as soon as you start actually looking at all these different particular contexts within which maps are made, used, and circulated. So by thinking about the materiality of the items and how they move around space, they might move not very far. A spoken map, an oral map, doesn't circulate very far at all. But that has a different set of principles around it for analysis than manuscript map or a printed map, or a printed map that was intended for a very small circulation. Just because the map is printed doesn't mean it gets widespread circulation. There are all sorts of ideas and presumptions that come to bear on how we think about, how we presume maps circulate, that shape how we then understand consumption and production, and therefore mapping as a whole. So the mapping as process gig is really a way to, it's a theory of methodology. It's not saying all maps are this way. I'm saying if we want to understand these things we can identify, we need to understand the formations that underpin them, and the formations are continually changing, and they're all very variable depending on the community involved. That's mapping as process.
Thank you, Matthew. We've got time for a couple more questions, so you can have a break soon. First one moves on, I think, from the mapping as process. How do your ideas about cartographic modes contribute to the understanding of cartography as process? Will the idea of cartographic modes be more important or central in your next books?
Yes and no in terms of being more important. In the current book, what I've actually come to realize is the way to understand the communities of people engaged in map history is through what I'm calling historiographical modes. The way, again, it's this, who's producing, who's consuming, how's the stuff getting between them, in an intellectual format rather than a spatial format, shall we say. So the mode idea, modes are where I began this whole project back in '93. Actually, even before I finished the dissertation in 1990. Jim Ackerman and I had a chat, must have been 89, 90. And I realized that Jim thought the same way that I did. So, aha, this is a good idea. I shall forward it. I shall work on it. And I published this article in '93 called Cartography Without Progress, because what I was trying to do was figure out how do we write the history of mapping, maps and mapping. Well, then I was still thinking in terms of cartography. How do we write the history of cartography without making assumptions of progress? That geographic progress and progress in the quality and quantity of information is the way by which to assess map history. Now, I'll also say that's not the only way progressive history is being written. That's chapter 6 of the new book. Which is only 10,000 words too long right now. But what I did was to say, well, look, I mean, if you talk about the history of the kind of general world maps and regional maps are in atlases and so on, that you can call geographical mapping, as opposed to property mapping. They're quite different. And one person might engage in both, depending on employment practices or in terms of who's consuming if there's a landowner who has a property plan, who's also consuming geography textbooks because, you know, general knowledge and so on, then he's consuming both kinds of map. But he'd be doing so in quite different contexts and for different reasons, thinking about the world in different ways. So the property plan is one thing, and the geographical map's a different thing. So I began working, trying to distinguish between pretty gross, it's a heuristic, is a way to try to understand the variety of mapping. And it's very good in teaching terms. You know, students can really handle the difference between a regional map and a C chart and a property map really easily. That's fine. But as you get more and more involved in actually asking that academic question of, does my theoretical concept help me explain something? Does it give me some kind of empirical grounding that allows me to say X happened because of Y, right? Modes don't help you. Modes are just too coarse. They're too big, they're too clunky, and you got to get way down. So one way you can get way down, one study I've done relatively recently was of the early printed maps of Portland, Maine for a local group. And it's very, very clear that up through the Civil War, there are two communities and two little very precise communities or networks of people producing and consuming these maps. One set is local. They're being produced locally for local consumption. And this is when Portland is a walking city. Everybody knows how to get around Portland. Yet they're buying directories with a map in. Not for navigational purpose, but for some other purpose. And then you've got this other group who are coming in from the outside who are engineers, and they are Philadelphia publishers. And at a period in the early 19th century when engineering is trying to professionalize and everything must be done by the book. So north must be at the top of the map. So one thing about Portland, I should say, is Portland is actually at an angle. The city, the peninsula of Portland's at an angle. It's called East End and West End. East End and West End, but it's actually northeast and southwest. But on the plain paper, to maximize the space, it's drawn, the peninsula's drawn out horizontally. There we go, drawn out horizontally. But no, these engineers, they've got to have north at the top. And so now the peninsula is running diagonally across the page, which means the paper gets bigger and, you know. So you can see very, very precisely, there's one little community that has one set of conventions, actually creates a very particular set of conventions about how to show this city. And then you got the outsiders coming in saying, no, we're going to do it in a different way. We're going to do it in a way that the national community expects maps to be done, measured north of the top. But at the same time, we're still making them for local consumption. So there's still other aspects which are locally focused. And so you can see these two communities interacting and then diverging a bit. So that kind of work is really, really detailed, nitty-gritty in spatial discourses. In one case, I even got one London solicitor in the 1740s, Ferdinando Paris, who is the linchpin, one person who's a linchpin for a whole little network of printed maps of the American colonies that were never published, but they were only for legal disputes. And they have a very particular aesthetic and style. Very, very narrow, very, very small group of people. Completely different from the much bigger distribution of a map of the colonies in the same period. So all this is to say that it's at this very detailed level that you can actually get to empirical evidence that allows you to say X caused Y. That actually allows you to say, give you historical explanation. The problem is is that this kind of really focused, narrow work is really hard. It takes a lot of time and you've got to do a lot of work. I stumbled into the two examples I have. So in between the mode and the spatial discourse, I like to think about threads of discourse where we can look at, for example, geographical mapping and education, which we can slice and dice in multiple threads as the maps being produced in formal textbooks. They're the maps that kids are being made because of certain educational ideas, or Pestalozzi, or whoever it would be. Each of these threads can vary over time and be differentially constituted, but they give us some sort of mid-level between broad generalizations at the mode level, the really very narrow spatial discourses, and then in sort of meso level in between, you've got sort of discursive threads, which can be readily identified and broken down. And that's what the third book is really all about, this trilogy and stuff.
Fantastic, Matthew. I think that's a really full answer to that one, and it sets us up quite nicely. You've mentioned
I thought about it at length.
I'm sorry for all the people who ask questions. We haven't had time to put them to Matthew, but we have gone beyond our time limit. So I'd love to thank Matthew and Liz for a terrific performance there. It's really got to have encouraged us all to go out and buy Matthew's book and learn more. Really thought-provoking stuff, Matthew. So thanks ever so much. We knew you would deliver, and you have done as far as we're concerned. So thank you.